Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar and Q&A session today. My name is Georgina Manok, and I'm the Assistant Director for Research and Assessment at the Swearer Center for Public Service at Brown University. The Swearer Center is the administrative home of the classification, which lives along with other institutional assessment tools and the Gateways International Journal within the Center's College and University Engagement Initiative. As part of my role, I've worked on the Carnegie classification for the last 2 years, and I'm excited to be talking to you today with my colleagues, and I'll let them introduce themselves. John?
Great, thanks. Can you advance the slide, Georgina? Great, thanks. So I'm John Saltmarsh. I also am with the Swearer Center as a visiting scholar. I also teach at the University of Massachusetts in our higher education doctoral program. And again, I want to thank Bobby and Emily for putting this together and look forward to this.
Emily?
Good afternoon. My name is Emily Slottick. I'm at the Democracy Collaborative and have been working on the Anchor dashboard work for about 3 years. We're really excited to be partnering with CUMU and the Carnegie Community Engagement Classification on the Anchor dashboard work, and I look forward to talking to you all about it.
Great.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bobby Lauer. I'm the Executive Director for CUMU. I'm thrilled to have about 60 of our members joining us today from 30 different institutions. The CUMU network is 100 members, which is exciting, and I'm sitting in my home office here at Towson University, and I'm really excited for the discussion that's going to take place today. I want to thank, just getting started right away, John and Georgina for really leading today's discussion, and Emily for being behind the scenes and making it all work and come together. This obviously was a topic that got a lot of interest, and I'm excited to see how we can support our members who are going through this process and thinking about the process in the future, which I know we do have some members who are in that frame of mind.
Thank you, Bobby, and thank you, Bobby and Emily, for organizing this. So our conversation today will address preparations for both first-time applicants and campuses that are reclassifying, which are campuses were classified in 2010. So the conversation will include an orientation to both the classification and reclassification frameworks, an overview of the 2020 timeline, strategies that have been effective for successful applicants, and an informal discussion for including the anchor mission as a complementary component of your application. And we actually have a member from Drexel University who will be sharing their experience about that as well. A little bit of a technical information. Because of the number of participants in the webinar, you will all be muted. And starting now, please put any questions you have using the Q&A function. We'll go through as many of those questions as we can in the time provided. The webinar will be recorded and will be made available along with the slides on the CUMU website. We'll also be sharing a link to resources on the Swearer website in the end for those of you who are watching the recording later on. So for the 2020 classification timeline, we announced the process in January 2018. In May was when we opened the application portal, and the applications will be due in April 15, 2019. And there's no deadline for specifically accessing the portal. We definitely encourage you to do that ahead of time so that you can troubleshoot anything that might happen or ask us any questions about the portal and the online framework. December 2019 is when the review process will be completed. So after the deadline, we'll start the review process with the National Review Committee, and that will be completed in December, and we will notify campuses by then, publicly notifying campuses and the public in January 2020 of campuses that are recognized. John?
Great, thanks, Georgina. So we want to start this conversation in a way that we usually talk about the Carnegie, which is when you're working on an application to really pay attention to the definition that the Carnegie Foundation provides. And so thinking about this in terms of partnerships with characteristics of reciprocity and collaboration is really important. And we say that because there are a lot of activities that we do on our campuses that are really important. We do really good internship work, we do really good experiential education work, but it might not be community engagement. It's important, but it may not fit what Carnegie is looking for. Similarly with anchor work, which we'll talk more about, we have gotten applications in the past where the campus frames the work around community engagement, which is really economic development work, and they call it community engagement. It doesn't touch the curriculum, it doesn't touch faculty or the students. And it's not that it's not important work, it is, it just doesn't fit the definition that Carnegie uses. So there's two parts to the Carnegie definition, the process of engagement, and the next slide, which is the purpose. So again, what we're trying to just reinforce is to pay attention to the definition when you're putting together your application. And we just share this as well as you're thinking about institutional engagement, how you implement engagement across the institution, that there are multiple dimensions to it. So we use this slide just to say that you should, in order to get the classification, you really need all of these dimensions. Another way to say that is having one or two or even three of them without all of them is going to be, it's going to make it difficult to be classified. So again, just think about all the different pieces that go into classification, that they create sort of this holistic whole of what it means to institutionalize engagement across the campus.
So what we're really looking for in the first time classification is for you to put forward your best evidence and to make your best case and tell your best story. And as part of that, changes to the framework that we've instituted since we became the home of the classification was adding a context section in the beginning for you to be able to tailor your story to your own narrative and your own explanation of what your local context is in terms of your university and your community. So there's 500 words each to describe your own local context and your own university, with some examples of information you could use to provide the reviewers before they go ahead and review all of your classification. So as a reminder, all narrative responses in the framework are limited to 500 words, and you will see that in the online framework, the portal will provide you with a word count and a word limit, and that will be clear. So if you're cutting and pasting things through it, I'll definitely make sure that your word count is working and all the paragraphs and endings are correct. So do not include web links to first-time classification. That's only accessible to reclassifying campuses. Reviewers for this framework will not be looking at links, and you will be using up the space in your response. For the reclassification documentation, this is designed for an evidence-based reflective process, specifically focusing on what has changed since receiving the last classification. The framework seeks evidence of how community engagement has become deeper, more pervasive, better integrated, and sustained. So the focus is on depth and quality within a sustainable institutional context, not greater quantity per se. So the framework is structured to include narrative responses, allowing you for an explanation of changes that have occurred since the previous classification. Another thing reviewers will be looking at is if you've made commitments in your previous classification of things you were planning to do or you were committing to do. That's something you will want to report on in a reclassification application. So what the narratives are designed to address is what currently exists, the changes since the last classification, and any relevant supporting evidence that you would like to include. Wherever requested, please provide links to any relevant campus web resources, in addition to evidence that you provide in the application. So reviewers may want to examine website and may even ask for a telephone conversation to clarify evidence provided. In general, some effective approaches have been used to apply for the classification and reclassification. It's really looking for an institutional perspective. This is not a classification for a center. This is for your whole campus. So working on a cross-institutional team, coordinating with other units, sharing your whole campus story and not the success story of one part of your campus is very important. So this is for a campus as a whole, and think of the selection that you're doing of examples as strong evidence to highlight alignment and pervasiveness across your campus unit. So if you've given way too many examples from the med school, you want to shy away from that and move a little bit to highlight examples elsewhere. So don't leave blanks. And so if you don't have evidence of something specific, There is an addition to the online framework now that if your answer is no to a question, you get an optional box where you can explain your answer. So if you haven't been collecting something, but you are committed to do it, and as part of this process, put something together to be collecting it, and like you put together a process specifically to be collecting it, you can write about that. But we definitely encourage you not to leave blanks. The no optional boxes are definitely optional. You don't have to use these, but we wanted to make space for campuses to share their story and any updates and any commitments they want to reflect on. John.
Mind you, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to remind everyone to use the Q&A function, and then we'll come back to questions that you have at the end of the presentation. The other thing I just want to say is, recently at a workshop we were at, there was a question related to what Georgina just talked about, which was in reclassification, this question about quality and quantity. So the question from the campus was, we actually have fewer community partners now than we did before. Is that okay? And the answer is yes, it's okay if there's an intentional process in terms of why you have fewer. And in their case, they were really trying to think about impact in the community and putting more concentration and resources into fewer partnerships to have greater impact. And so that's the story that they're telling. So it's not an expectation that you always have more, but that you really thought carefully about the quality of what you're doing. All right, so going back to the review standards, what I think of here are the way that reviewers are approaching your application. So a number of things to keep in mind. It's a holistic review. At the very beginning of the application, there's sections around context, both institutional context and community context. So your application is evaluated highly contextually and holistically. So we're looking at context and we're looking at the whole application. There's no one question or even set of questions that's either going to make or break an application. It's taken as a whole. And having said that, there is the section at the beginning on foundational indicators, and reviewers look at those as clearly foundational. They create scaffolding for the rest of the application. So those are really important. Those are ones that you really want to pay attention to. And again, I'll just reinforce what Georgina said. If the answer is not yes, use the opportunity to explain why it is that you're not doing whatever that particular area is. And if you have any plans to be doing something in that area, then that's where you would put that. Even though it's a no, there's a box for you to be able to provide some narrative. Another thing reviewers are looking for is a coherent institutional narrative. And so think about that when you're putting together sort of the final piece. Who's going to write that? How is this going to be told in a way that it doesn't sound like it's been written by 5 different people and it doesn't connect well? Okay, can you go to the next slide? Thanks. Another thing reviewers look for is alignment across the application. Just one example of that would be at the beginning where there's a part where it says, the campus, based on its mission, is absolutely committed to community engagement as part of its institutional identity. And then the reviewer gets to the question around strategic plan, and there's nothing in the strategic plan. And then that raises questions for the reviewer about what's going on here. Is this really aligned across the institution? And so you could do that with any number of parts of the application. And so just think about that alignment when you're putting it together, because reviewers are thinking about that. And then the last thing is around implementation. Keep in mind that the classification is for community engagement activity that's been implemented, not aspired to. And so we'll always get a few applications where the language is always, we hope to, we will, we plan to, sometime we'll get to it. And they're all really good ideas. And if they all get implemented, then probably in the next round of the classification, there'd be a good chance of being classified, but it's not going to work this time. And that doesn't mean that there can't be a mix of things, right? You can be have implemented some things already and then plan to implement things in the future, that's fine. Just make it clear in the boxes in terms of sort of what you've done and what you plan to do. All right, let's shift here slightly to the anchor dashboard in relationship to the community engagement classification. So a few things. One is that in the application, in the foundational indicators, there are now new questions that weren't there in the last cycle, which are directly related to anchor institution work. So one of them is around how the institution invests its financial resources in the community or with community partnerships for the purpose of community engagement and community development. That's an anchor question. There's also a question around business operations, hiring, purchasing, and procurement. Again, this is one of those kind of alignment questions. So doing all the great community engagement work in one part of the campus, is it also in the business operations? And then another place where the anchor institution work shows up, also in foundational indicators, is a question about campus-wide assessments that you've done, and then when were they done, and what did you learn from them? And you'll see in the box at the bottom here, one of those tools might be the anchor institution dashboard, as well as a number of other tools. So if you've used the dashboard and you're using the dashboard, then this would be an opportunity to talk about when you've done it, and then what did you learn from it. So again, there's another place where the anchor work fits in directly to the indicators on the classification framework. So having said that, the two instruments, the dashboard and the classification, are really quite different, and even though they're different, they should be treated as complementary to each other. And so Carnegie campuses should be looking at dashboard indicators, dashboard campuses should be attending to the Carnegie indicators. And the anchor dashboard work can support documenting community engagement, but it's not a replacement for it. Think about the example that I gave you earlier of a campus that does really good economic development work and calls it community engagement. That's not going to work for a classification. It'd be nice if that were part of what they're doing institutionally. It's not a substitute for engagement across the institution, particularly in the core academic work of the institution. So the completion of the dashboard can be powerful evidence and a significant piece of evidence that can be submitted, but it's not going to work if it's the only evidence. And then just keep in mind too that the purpose of the elective classification, when Carnegie designed this, it was intended to encourage change on campuses, particularly change that reshapes the core academic work of the campus. So therefore, it's looking across the application for evidence of ways in which the culture, policies, structures, and practices of faculty and student are changed by community engagement. It's really aimed at sort of this transformation of the way that we do our work. And so I say that because then the question that I think about when I look at anchor dashboard work is the purpose of the anchor mission is to, and then you can sort of fill in the blanks as you approach this, what is the purpose of the work in terms of thinking about institutional change? And then questions that you might want to just sort of ask in that framework are, in what ways is it a call for transformation? And how does it impact the core academic work of the campus? And how are faculty and students involved? And how does that integration between sort of the community and economic development work and the academic work take place? So to talk about that a little bit, we're going to turn it over to the folks at Drexel who think about their anchored institution work in more of this kind of integrated way.
Thanks, John.
Hi, everybody.
So you want to just say who you are?
Sure, I'm Jennifer Johnson-Keeby. I'm the Executive Director of Drexel University's Lindy Center for Civic Engagement. And we primarily think a lot about the connections between students, faculty, and community. But I'm part of a larger team here that thinks a lot about our anchor strategy as well. And we spend quite a bit of time thinking about how all of these components really overlap and intersect at Drexel. And I'm joined by my colleague, Jen. Go ahead.
Yep, Jen Britton. I am part of that larger team that Jen just mentioned, the Office of University and Community Partnerships, where I'm the Director of Communications and Special Projects, which means I'm a sort of like do all kinds of things. But I think a lot about how we categorize and talk about our work and how we think about data and impact.
And so I might just jump into, this is Emily Slottick with the Democracy Collaborative. And we've been working with several CUMU members over the past year. Drexel is part of our original Anchor Dashboard Learning Cohort, so they have been working on this for 3 years. So you can hear that they have a bit of a more robust integrated strategy, but I wanted to go over some just high level ways that you can begin to integrate the work and then pass it back for Drexel for them to give you more concrete examples of what that looks like. So the first thing is when you think about integrating the work in the ways that John described, where you're really, it's about economic development, but we're also looking for full integration and institutionalization across the campus, and particularly with community engagement work. So the first step is to kind of define local. This is one of the areas where you want to think about who your partnerships are and who your community is and who the institution wants to have a long-term relationship with. So when you begin tracking the measures, you're tracking at census tract, zip code, city, and in some cases counties. So that's a really good discussion to begin having around this work. You'll then move on to tracking measures like percentage of staff at a living wage, or percent of local residents in staff positions, percent of minority staff. So these are baseline measures that you'll begin collecting as part of the Anchor dashboard. And then you can think about what key strategies do we want to undertake to advance that measure. So in the case of hiring, you can think about, can we conduct focus groups with local residents to understand their existing skill set or any barriers or challenges they're having? Can we host resume building workshops and other job skills workshops or on campus for local residents? So those are some beginning ways that you can kind of start thinking about how can your support of local hiring initiatives begin to include the broader community and to begin students and faculty in their teaching and learning. And I'll let Drexel kind of pick up for how that's looking at your campus.
Sure. So I'll jump in first. I think, first it's important to point out that I think oftentimes the anchor work immediately gets codified as being, really just in the economic development space. And I don't find that to be true. If you really look at the anchor dashboard, there are metrics across 5 different dimensions, including community building, education, health, safety, and the environment. And I think we find our community engagement situated and located in all of those spaces. And I think you really can find very compelling examples of academically engaged community engagement that are in that space for sure. So how do we think about this at Drexel? We certainly don't separate out our role as an anchor institution at all. We think about it really in an integrated way with our academic engagement in the space and also our more general public service in this space as well. So what does that look like on the ground? We may very well be involving students very intentionally in projects that might fall in that economic space. If we're thinking about pipeline development for job creation, students can be involved in that and thinking about how they can support that, how they can research that, how they can, be part of those programs. When you think about an education strategy, you can have students and faculty support that throughout, and we do at Drexel. We're really thinking about how those are integrated, and we end up with some really compelling community engagement examples that are coming out of that. I guess my point is that, if an institution as an engaged citizen itself is going to be really leveraging its resources in this space, our number one resource are our students, followed by our faculty. Why are we not mobilizing them in all of these spaces? And we've been starting to do that at Drexel for sure. Jen, you want to jump in with any other examples?
Sure, yeah. When we think about the ways in which the civic engagement piece and the anchor mission piece are so integrated. There are some great examples of how we are supporting, I don't know, website development for local businesses in a way that supports our early childhood education strategy, where students are directly helping some of the sort of childcare centers that we are supporting as part of our cradle to career support structure. We are trying to sort of increasingly kind of take down that wall that people imagine between these two ideas, the anchor mission and civic engagement, by getting our business students involved at our Joint Site Center for Neighborhood Partnerships, helping in the computer lab, helping with job training, and so on. So yeah, I don't know if that helps. Emily, did you have another specific question that you wanted us to address?
When we think about the Carnegie and what people will be needing to fill out and kind of show, it's not only about what are you doing in for the 2020 application, right? What is your what currently exists, but what have you achieved since the last classification? So it's also a bit looking forward to what might you be wanting to show in 2030. So I think some good, maybe basic strategies you can put down if you haven't really started along the anchor mission path, but you want to show some work as you progress towards the next decade, is to think about how you can begin institutionalizing it. So similar to what John said, how is this aligned with your strategic plan? What goals are you setting around it? Are there committees that work similar to the alignment that's at Drexel that shows up where it's under the University Partnerships Program? And so both the anchor staff and the community engagement staff are working closely together and don't really see a division amongst their work. And so that way that's showing up in the Higher Education Anchor Mission Initiative is that there's monthly, there's committees that meet regularly to discuss this, and they involve community engagement staff along with hiring human resource directors and procurement officers, communications and advancement staff. There is also empathy interviews that we've been collecting and goal setting. So some examples of goals that are taking place currently is procurement example would be by 2019, increase local procurement by 25% with city businesses. So I would encourage people to think about what is a goal that you could set for yourself that, to Drexel's point, shows involvement of students, shows involvement of partners like workforce development agencies or small business developers. And then as you work across the next decade, hopefully that can be refined and built out a little bit. So those are some more suggestions that I would just offer.
Yeah. Emily, if I could just add one additional thing. You know, I think it's really fair that Carnegie has a very specific definition of community engagement and where that kind of stands. And this anchor work is growing up alongside of it. And I think our institutions need to kind of reconcile that for ourselves. Where does this work fit into the larger mission? Is it alongside of it? Is it adjacent to it, or is it integrated? And my hope would be that we can, you know, continue to identify ways to really integrate this in a way that really builds out the field.
Yeah, and to add to that, Jen, I think when we, at Drexel, we kind of take this on, the notion of civic engagement, as we think that it's part of the core mission of higher ed. And furthermore, we find that there are some benefits to that. We are recruiting and hiring leadership level folks who are attracted to Drexel because of it. We now understand that incoming freshmen are choosing Drexel because of the local anchor mission work that we're doing. So it's not just a sort of bonus activity that rides alongside our academic mission, but we're really thinking about how it's built into part of Drexel's mission to do applied learning.
Mm-hmm. It starts to make you ask the question, where is community engagement happening on campus? There are probably more answers than we've considered before.
And that's one of the things we hope the Anchor Mission, and I think in parallel with the Carnegie, that's the purpose of how do we start getting more alignment across our campuses so that all of our resources are moving towards mutual benefit with community. And that's one of the strengths I think the Anchor Mission can really play in the work is around this aspect of reciprocity. How can we make sure that there is some economic reciprocity along with the intellectual and the social reciprocity that we're doing through our work currently with our campus and community partners?
I just jump in here because I think the Drexel example is great, and I thank both the Jens for sharing that. For the people who are on the webinar, could you just go a little bit further in terms of saying more about the structure and roles? So Jen, Jen Britton, where are you located on the campus? And then how do you think about your role from that location?
So John, do you mean where I'm literally physically located or my organizational home?
Yeah, your organizational home.
Okay, that's what so I'm part of the Office of University and Community Partnerships, which is a unit that Drexel established in 2010-11 when our current president, John Fry, came on board. And we kind of are the connective tissue of civic engagement and the Anchor Mission at Drexel. So we're sort of supporting our faculty and students in their own civic engagement agendas, but we're also working really closely with the operations side of the university. Our folks in HR, in procurement services, in facilities, and sort of working with them and imagining how we can be sort of creating a shared economy with West Philadelphia.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we'll move on, and I think actually what we just heard from Drexel is just as the last point we want to make here, use the anchor work to tell your story, tell your institutional story, and that's what Drexel was just doing, and they were able to tell a really good story of integration, how the work around their anchor mission and their Carnegie community engagement work is actually fundamentally connected to one another. And how they structure that on the campus, how they develop roles, how someone who's doing the anchor work is seen as somebody who is doing sort of core work on the campus, not someone off on the periphery, what's seen as the core of the campus. So it's that kind of story that you want to be able to tell in the application.
All right, any last comments, John, before we move forward with questions and answers?
Yeah, I don't think so. Why don't we move into the questions? But again, I just encourage people to continue to put questions in the Q&A, and then we'll get to as many as we can.
Great, so one question that we answered that I'll just repeat is that a university was classified in 2015. When is our reclassification due? So campuses that are classified get their classification for 10 years. So you get to skip a cycle. So you'll have to apply for the 2025 cycle. And just like the timeline for this classification happened, the framework for the 2025 cycle will be available in 2023 with an expected deadline of April 2024. And for those of you who are classified in 2015, we definitely encourage you, and I think being on this webinar is part of that. We definitely encourage you to look at the current framework to see the changes since you've last been classified, to be monitoring any new questions that you may not have been collecting information on. I'll continue with some of the questions. So partnership framework, is it recommended that we show growth in the partnerships that were submitted in the last application, or focus on new partnerships that were not mentioned in the last application? So I think we covered some of that in what John had shared earlier in terms of quality, not quantity. John, do you want to add something here?
I guess the only thing I would add is it's sort of going back to making the best case and telling the best story. You've got 15 partnerships that you can share information about. And if part of your story is that we've really been intentional about creating new partnerships, then that should be reflected in those 15. Some of those should be new. They don't have a lot of history. But part of it might be too that you actually have some really long-term partnerships that you've had. And so that should be reflected in there as well, that these are partnerships that we've been doing for a decade or more. We've built certain relationships. So use the 15 to really kind of make the best case you can, and do it in the context of what it is you're trying to accomplish and the intentionality behind it, that this isn't just sort of random partnership activity.
Thanks, John. The next question is, 2020 application is based on academic year 17-18, but what if we have community engagement activity and or Anchor Institute activity that has taken place in academic year 18-19? Can that be included, or are we limited to 17-18? So I think a helpful frame to think about this is there's a lot of questions within the application that are asking for academic year data. April 15, 2019 is not the end of an academic year. So the last academic year where you have full access to a full year's data is 17-18. So any question that's asking questions around courses, around academic information, around programming, you would want to use a full year of academic information. And for that, the most recent year is 17-18. Any other tool that you might be using on your campus, whether it's the Anchor mission dashboard, any like global tool that you've run on your own, any information that you've collected this February or through your own, whatever tools you're using on your campus, could be used in the framework. Again, as long as it's not academic year data, because that won't be a full year of data. So if you have more recent data than the academic year information, feel free to use that in your framework answers. And you will, in most questions around data, there will be a follow-up question. How is this data collected? Explain the data. So in your narrative, make sure you explain what year this information is from, how you've collected that information. And just as a reminder, all the way in the end of the framework, in the reflections section, there is a question that is asking if you have any additional, if you need more space to answer any question. So feel free to use that space if you feel like you don't have enough space in other pieces of the framework to answer that, or to share where your data is from. Whatever data you use, make sure you share what year it's from and what tool you've used to collect it. And again, academic year information has to be the last academic year. So that's this one. I have questions regarding the section titled Categories of Community Engagement, Teaching and Learning. For the table in A13, is percentage of total departments based on growth from community engagement departments in the last application, or based on community engaged departments as a proportion of total departments at the institution? The second part, so it's based on community engagement departments as a percentage of total departments on the institution.
And there's a similar question there about courses, so the answer is the same there too.
Yeah.
But Alina, if you do have more questions and you want to do a call, just email us and we can set that up.
Great. How does Carnegie verify evidence given that links and attachments are not allowed? John, do you want to do that?
Sure. So hi, Chris. Yeah, I think it's one of those things. It's there are limitations to any instrument. One of the limitations to the Carnegie is around quality, and so campuses can say they're doing something, but there's really not a way of knowing what the quality is. We don't use links on the first time because we just don't have the review capacity to be able to go into those links. We do use them on the reclass because the reviewers will actually want to look at those links. And you'll see if you're doing reclass that it says that reviewers might even ask for a conversation. So we're trying to do more of that with the reclass. We just can't do it in the first time.
Great. If folks have any other questions, I'm just going to walk through some of the resources that we have available for your use. We recently, John and Matthew Johnson recently published a book that several campuses have contributed to, the elective Carnegie Community Engagement Classification. I've actually contributed a few chapters here to kind of narrow down key questions for each section that would be helpful. The first chapter of that is available online, which provides a history and a narrative around the classification and its evolution over time. So that might be a helpful resource as you're working through to learn from other campus experiences. Our College and University Engagement Initiative website through the Square Center has Carnegie specific resources, and that includes relevant publications, some assessment tools that you might be able to use, and some other useful information, including a link to webinar slides that we use that are much longer than this conversation we just had. So our regular workshops that we've been facilitating all over the country, there's a full slide deck from those that's available there. So that's another space where you can use some of those resources. Can you speak to a word limit for reclassification boxes? Is there a limit? So again, every single box has a 500 word limit. In the reclassification online portal, links will count as one word. So if you include a link in your box, that will count as one word. What type of feedback will we receive once a determination about our application has been made? So if you receive your classification, you will receive a notification in December. And if you don't get classified, you also receive the information in December, but you'll also get the chance to schedule a call with the review committee. We're streamlining the process of collecting notes from the review committee this time. Since we have much more expanded capacities in our portal, we're moving our review process to be fully online. And so we'll be able to give more extensive feedback. John, do you want to share a little bit around what kind of feedback you usually share with campuses on those calls?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so that was really great, Georgina. If you aren't successful, you have the opportunity to have a call with one of the reviewers, and you'll get specific feedback on your application. In the last cycle, we did about 40 of those calls. Many of those campuses have now reapplied, and we do this every cycle, and what we find is the campuses that really take that feedback seriously come back with successful applications. So you'll have that opportunity, and we hopefully we suggest that you'll take us up on it. So that's just a good way to sort of move things forward. It's also another way to look at it is that if you're hesitant about turning in your application because you feel like you really haven't quite got kind of your institutional act together enough to be classified, there are benefits even in being non-classified, in the sense that you get that feedback that then you can use to advance the work. Also, just keep in mind that if you aren't classified, Carnegie doesn't make that information public. So there's no list of unclassified campuses. Only the ones that are classified are the ones that are announced.
And I will mention here that as part of the book, there is a chapter that is a campus reflection on their story of not getting the classification and what they did after that. So if you're interested in reading about someone who was unsuccessful as a campus and what they did about that, that's available there. There is, in the last reflection questions, and I know they're optional, I just want to definitely encourage you to use that space. There's a question that is asking for your feedback on the framework or anything else that you want to share that you feel is evidence for community engaged work that we didn't ask through the framework. And I definitely encourage you to use that space. We take those feedback reflections very seriously, and we're committed to continuing to improve the framework, just like we did with this round, to add new evolving changes in the field and things that are missing in the framework. So if you have any feedback or input on that, please feel free to use that space. We will plan on reviewing all those answers from that space and making a process, an open process for soliciting feedback on framework changes for the 2025. So we definitely invite you to be part of that process. in an initial stage formally through your application process. Do folks have any other questions? We have some more time. We definitely encourage you to use the Q&A function. I'll say some technical things that I feel like we've been asked a lot about the online portal that might be helpful. So for folks who haven't like actually accessed the online portal yet, you can do that through our Carnegie page on our website. Once you do that, you complete the payment, you will receive a receipt. I would definitely check my spam because sometimes that's where it goes. So the receipt will include a link to access the application, and you can save that link so that you can use it whenever you want to access the framework. We added a collaborate feature. So we've heard a lot from campuses that they want more than one person to be able to access this so that the burden is not on one final person to be inputting all this information. So we have a collaborate feature. You'll see the sections on the portal that include a collaborate box. So if you click on that, you'll be able to add as many collaborators as you want. We've got great feedback on this feature, and we're hoping that for next round, we'll be able to add layers of access for these collaborators so that you might be able to have a view-only collaborator and others who may be able to edit the content. So that we don't have rolled out yet, but that's a feature that's that we're expecting to build for the next round. So you feel free to add however many collaborators you need. They'll get access to the link, so they just sign up with an account and we'll be able to access it. The online framework is the most recent version and the final version of the application. You'll find some of the questions are very slightly formatted differently, or maybe numbered slightly differently, just because we've tried to make it as user-friendly as possible. And it's not, we try to give you a PDF as early as possible so you can start planning, but the final edits and changes are on the portal. There are no content changes. The main changes will be, you'll actually see a table that you'll fill out and may not have been a table in the framework. So as you're cutting and pasting things, or as you're filling it out, don't get shocked. There's some changes that we try to do to improve the process. John, do you have any other thoughts as we're closing for today?
I don't think so. I guess I would just say that if questions come up that anyone has, that you can always email us. And if, again, we need to, we can set up a call with you. We'd be happy to do that. I do want to say I think it was great to have the two Jens from Drexel on to provide that example. It's exactly the kind of integration that really brings these two instruments together in a really important way. So that was great to have them part of this conversation.
Definitely. So I'm not sure I understand the question that's posted now, but I'll double check the numbering and see if there's an error there. So we'll follow up on this. So like John mentioned, we have been answering questions for the last year now. Feel free to reach out. There's a little picture of me and the contact box on the framework. So we've been fielding a lot of questions through that. We're not able to provide consulting services to a campus. So if you call us, we're not going to give you strategies and specific things on how to answer questions, but we will be able to direct you through, you might ask us for clarifications around what is meant or what is evidence that works here, and questions like that, and any technical questions that we may be able to clarify. So I think that's it for the Q&A. I want to thank Debbie Dar for all your planning work on this webinar, and anyone else on the team that we may not have interacted with who contributed to this. And thanks again to Emily and Bobby for making this happen, and to Jennifer and Jen from Drexel for sharing your reflections today. We hope you found this conversation today helpful, and we look forward to continue our collaboration together and to continue to align our efforts to support our work and the field and to center reciprocal, mutually beneficial university community partnerships. If you have any questions, like John said, please feel free to reach out to us. This is our contact information. And you can also contact us through the portal. And you can check our resource page for additional resources and publications that you might find helpful. And I'll give the last word to Bobby for closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Georgina. And I know everybody on the webinar would be joining me in a round of applause if we were doing that for all of our participants. I think as a community of folks who are deeply committed to our role in our cities and in our communities as CUMU members, I know I want to give a special shout out to John Saltmarsh, not just for participating in today, but John has been supporting CUMU and CUMU members and at a CUMU member institution for, I don't want to put a year stamp on it, but likely as long as the coalition's been in motion, which is close to 30 years. And so we as a community, as in a network and as a sector are all lucky to have your leadership, John, and your intellectual power in moving this space forward. So I don't want to be remiss to recognize your work specifically on this Carnegie process, but much broader to what you've done for the field and for all of us who have jobs, honestly, in this space of community engagement, owe a big part of those roles even existing to the work that you've been leading. So thank you on that front.
Thank you.
I do want to close with a couple of small comments. One is that Jen Kibia, and thank you, Emily, for bringing this up and reminding me, Jen Kibia actually just contributed an article that is titled Developing the Student Anchor Engagement Framework. It's featured in the latest issue of the Metropolitan University's Journal, which I'm sure all of you on this webinar have already read beginning to end in every article, but in case you didn't, we will make sure that we send out the issue link to everyone who's on the webinar. But in addition to Jen's great article, I also want to point out that Emily is the guest editor of the entire issue and did a phenomenal job. Emily, how many abstracts did we get for this issue?
Not any.
About 20 abstracts, which anybody who's in the journal business these days knows that that is really a huge feat. And so we actually narrowed it down to an incredible list that are in this issue, and we're hoping to find some spaces to publish some additional articles. But this is a great issue for folks that are interested in this topic, and so we'll make sure to put this front and center of everyone, and both Emily and Jen are represented in that issue. So thank you guys for those contributions. I just wanted to also close this call and also let you know we'll make sure you guys get the recording, and we'll be posting on our website for all of our members. But I just want to close the call with, I think, reflecting on some of the comments that were made and drawing attention to how far the field has moved in really a pretty short amount of time. You know, talking about using some of Emily's words related to economic reciprocity and talking about the growth of community engagement and how we've, for those of us in community engagement, have talked about this mutual benefit related to community partnerships for a really long time. But to hear people like Jen Britton come up and talk about, you know, creating a shared economy with West Philadelphia, the way Drexel is approaching this is really just leaps and bounds. And part of that is really owed to the work of the Democracy Collaborative and the Anchor Dashboard Collective, that's Anchor Dashboard group that's been meeting for 7 years with Emily's great leadership. But, you know, I loved some of Jen Britton's word as well around creating this connective tissue that many of us are focused on doing related to the civic and the anchor and the student work. And I just think that this Carnegie process, the classification presents, just as John said, a really amazing opportunity for all of us to tell our story, and to tell our story in a way that can be nationally recognized and benchmarked, but also then be used as a starting point to have these critical conversations in our communities. So I think I just really appreciated hearing these two sides that often I think we're still as a community figuring out how they come together related to the anchor local hiring and purchasing work, and also our traditional kind of embedded community engagement functions. And I want to put in one more plug, and that is that the 2019 annual conference that I hope most of you are planning to attend is in Philadelphia this year. And I'm working closely with Jen Kibia as our point of contact at Drexel to really ensure that we're able to tell this Drexel story in an even more deeper and prolific way, because really what they're doing is a national model for a lot of us to understand and really think about how it can translate into our own communities and specific needs. So I know we hadn't planned on it, but I do, because we have a couple extra minutes, I just want to end with asking if there's any closing comments that either Emily or Jen also want to make. In that light. Emily?
Yes, I really I have been part of this work for now 3 years, and I'm always amazed at the people in higher ed. You've been doing this work day in, day out for years and thinking innovatively about how to forward this. So it's great to be able to work with you all on developing this infrastructure and continuing to think ways that we can really have the on-the-ground impact that our communities are so desperately need and are looking to higher ed to really put more commitment behind. So right, just a brain trust. So I know we're remote and on webinar, but it's always great to connect, and we look forward to connecting with you further as we develop this work. And you have my contact information on the screen. I know this recording will go up onto CUMU afterwards, so feel free to reach out if that would be helpful.
Thank you, Emily. And Drexel team, any closing comments?
My closing comment really would just be to continue to think about this work synthetically, that these concepts are connected and probably more interrelated than any of us really realize. And then my plug that I always make across all of these ways of being engaged in community is that students should be involved in all of this. So if you can figure out a way to do that, I think that's a real success.
Yeah. Yeah, and building on what Jen said, I think that conceiving of civic engagement and the anchor mission work as being part of your institution's DNA just has so many payoffs in the way it enriches your core mission of doing education and research. And we're really feeling that that benefit now. So there's a payoff with our community partners, and there's a payoff inside the institution.
Wonderful. Okay, well, unless Georgina or John, you guys have any closing comments?
I don't. Thank you, Bobby.
Thank you. And thank you both for all you're doing to support us across this board. And good luck to everyone as you apply to the classification and go up for the reclassification. And we are all here to support you and look forward to celebrating at the end of this year with additional CUMU members being classified. So thank you all, and we'll make sure everyone gets the presentation as well as a link to the journal issue that was just published.